Welcome back to another edition of the podcast, and tonight we are going to be reflecting on the first third or so of the National League season. So we're 1 month into the National League season now, or 2 months I should say, and it's been as chaotic as ever. We've already seen over 400 goals scored, which is more goals scored than any other division in English football in the top 5 leagues. We've seen 7 managerial departures, which once again is more than any other division in English football in the top 5. And 2 of the newly promoted sides as well currently sit in the top 7. I'm going to ask you both, how would you sum up this National League season so far? I suppose I would, probably unpredictable as ever. What about you, Joe, firstly?
Yeah, definitely that. I think what we probably expected before ball was kicked is probably not played out. There's been a lot of surprises, a lot of teams that have done better than we expected. Certainly one that's done better than I expected in Scunthorpe. And there's been a couple of teams who we perhaps expected to be better than they have been, that have perhaps struggled or not quite hit their groove yet. The likes of York and Carlisle. And then there's 1 or 2 teams that I had in and around the playoffs that have certainly really struggled, the likes of Sutton. So, yeah, it's certainly been chaotic, but that's the National League for you, isn't it? That's why you love the National League. And yeah, I think it's been good. Really, really intriguing for the neutral.
Yeah, we're going to go into detail about these 2 sides specifically tonight, but Scunthorpe and Bournemouth, it's very rare that even one of the newly promoted sides, even though they are quite well-established clubs that have previously been in this division, but hit it off like they both have. Of course, both currently sit in the top 7. Both have only had 1 defeat all season. Of course, for Bournemouth, that was actually on the opening day, and as for Scunthorpe, it only came on Saturday against Carlisle. I think both have certainly shocked me because... And I believe you as well, Joe, because I don't think anyone felt that, they'd be pulling up any trees in terms of the recruitment in the summer. Of course, both actually got promoted via the playoffs too.
Yeah, I think more so with Bournemouth, we kind of expected that a little bit. They've got a really experienced team, a really good manager. And of the 2 teams, we probably expected them to adjust better to the National League. I did have 1 or 2 question marks over Scunthorpe, of which probably they came from what I was reading from their own fan base during the summer, largely being the goalkeeper and whether they could rely on Roberts. But what they've done is they've adapted their system. They're playing a different way to what actually got them promoted, which you perhaps couldn't envisage. And they've signed a couple of players in the summer, Scunthorpe, the likes of Ollie Ewing, who's come from sort of academy football, relative unknown, and has been terrific for them. So, yeah, I mean, both of them have been good, haven't they? So, yeah, they'll be looking to... I think both of them, their aim, first and foremost, is to just stabilise as a steady mid-table team. But I think as the season has gone so far, I think both of them will be readjusting and thinking, do you know what? I think we could probably get in the top 7 come the end.
100%. And I suppose as well, we'll come on to this, but, you're looking at Bournemouth as well. A lot of people will look from the lazy eye from previous times of being in the National League as a side that, play quite an industrial style of football that's, really hard to break down. And to be honest, it's been the complete opposite. And what's so impressive is the fact that it's the same manager who was being known to play that industrial style of football that's actually completely changed the style of play to be quite free-flowing, attractive football to watch, whilst also picking up the results. Bournemouth for me is certainly a side that I'm going to be watching a lot more in detail this season so far. Ryan, for you then, National League season so far, what's been your overall takeaways from it?
Just enjoyment, I've got to be honest.
Yeah.
I think as Joe's touched on, it's so many teams have beaten so many teams. We've had, particularly recently, we've had this clutch of games where all the... I don't really like using the phrase, but the big clubs are all sort of facing each other. We've had Forest Green play York and Carlisle. We've had York absolutely thump Carlisle. We've had Scunthorpe, obviously, with their unbeaten run playing a lot of the top sides. We've had, a lot of those sorts of games, and it's just been very intriguing to see who comes out on the better side of things. And as we're seeing, one win almost makes no difference. One win is followed up by a defeat out of nowhere, and teams are just taking points off each other left, right, and centre. And it's just making for a very enjoyable watch on the whole. I feel like I'm going into a lot of weekends sort of looking for a game to watch, and I'm finding there's about 4, 5, 6 games I'm sort of having to choose between as to what genuinely looks like an enticing match to sort of see that just has a little bit of bit of intrigue, bit of need, or maybe a decent tactical battle. And that's not just at the top end either. I sat and watched Boston v Gateshead on Saturday afternoon rather than York v Hartlepool because the intrigue of sort of both sides playing the way they do. It looked like it'd be an entertaining game, and it kind of proved that way. Yeah, I'm just enjoying the entire division at the moment. A lot of fun, a lot of points being taken off each other, and quite a lot of goals as well. Yeah, a lot of fun.
Yeah, like I mentioned, we've already seen over 400 goals scored this season in the National League, and I do believe goals per game as well. In terms of all 5 divisions, the top 5 divisions, it's actually the average, the most goals per game in all those divisions as well. So it's not just a case of the National League playing more games than any other division. It is a case of them, as I've said, being more entertaining at the moment too. Of course, the top of the table is stealing a lot of the spotlight at the moment because it's just absolute carnage towards the top. But Rochdale themselves currently sit top of the National League tree. Of course, there was quite high expectations for them in the summer. A lot of people felt that it could potentially kick on and be in the title race this season. And they've already took 30 points out of a possible of 36. And they've actually got 2 games in hand on Forest Green Rovers, who currently sit second, and they're a point above them. Of course, the time of recording, it's the day after Rochdale faced Forest Green Rovers in the league. And of course, they're the first side to actually defeat Forest Green this season. Joe, was you expecting that?
I certainly expected Rochdale to start well. I think they're a really, really good side, and I think they've already shown improvement on last season. They've made a couple of changes, obviously Manny Dizarouve being the big one, coming in, leading the line, and I think he's just taken them up to that next level. They've always been a really well-coached team, really good passers of the ball, defend really well, but they've now got that little bit of nous in the final third in Dizarouve, and it makes a huge difference. And I think what Jim McNulty's got there is he's got a team which he's kind of been moulding for the last couple of years, consistently getting better. And it feels like now they are the best equipped that they have been since they've been back at this level to make that push to win the league. They've got a stronger 11, more stable first 11, and they've actually got quality off the bench as well, which I perhaps wouldn't have said that they had in recent seasons. So, yeah, it's been a really, really good start for them. And that's obviously a massive statement to go and, take Forest Green's unbeaten start away.
I suppose we're getting to a point with Forest Green where it felt like they were never going to get beaten. I know in previous weeks they got a little bit close. I remember that Scunthorpe game specifically where Scunthorpe were leading, I think, until like the 90 plus 3rd minute. And of course, Forest Green, like they always do, managed to get back into it. But, yesterday when I watched a bit of that game, the highlights back, I should say, did feel like Rochdale, in my opinion, probably deserved to win. And I suppose for them overall as an outfit this season, I actually thought last season, in terms of the football they like to play, it were very good on the eye. It just felt like at times they were missing that final piece in the jigsaw. And I certainly do feel like this season they found that final piece in Manny Dizarouve. Ryan, what's your thoughts been on the impact that he's had at Rochdale? And do you think that he is that missing piece in the jigsaw that's going to be able to take them on from being a playoff side to a title contender this season?
I mean, yeah, for sure. I think as well, it's also worth noting, as well as Dizarouve has done, they've also brought in a very similar sort of player to back him up as well. And I think that's the key across the squad. When you look at their starting 11, they've probably only really made 2 or 3 changes so far to their strongest 11, or as they've played so far. That being the goalkeeper, which was a problem last year because they ended up using quite a few different keepers. And the attack, obviously, Cairo Mitchell left, Mr. Absolute, probably should have scored within about a minute of the weekend. They brought in Disaruvway, and I suppose the left wing back's kind of been up for debate with Elarakia, Pritchard, and now Burko. But for the most part, they've got a very similar side to the one that played last season with that increased depth behind them. The thing that's impressed me most with Rochdale, and I watched the game in full at the weekend, there's an edge to them. I thought last season they had this ability, they'd win one, lose one, win one, lose one, win a couple, lose a couple. And it felt like they're a team you could kind of get at or wind up or just do enough to take them off their game at times. And I think Minotti also played into that a little bit as well. He, the way he talks is very... I think he talks from the heart, and I don't think he says anything wrong, but I think he has a way of trying to maybe dilute issues at times and talk in a way that it's not always making excuses, but it all kind of comes across that way, sort of, a little bit defeatist. And I feel like he's talking a bolder game this year. I think watching them at the weekend, they're doing the dark arts. They're kicking the ball out of play. They're rolling back onto the pitch. They're wasting time and doing the things that people don't like to watch, but they're also things that are very important for teams to do to get over the line, and particularly in games like that. They've scored a goal from a set piece, had the better chances on the break towards the end. I think Tyler Smith probably should have scored one or two, and held their own, defended the box and did everything right. And when they needed to, they brought on players of genuine quality. And yeah, I think it feels like the whole club are taking it a little bit more seriously this year, and that's not to say they weren't previously, but there's just that difference in the way they're doing things, and I think that's a very important thing when you're talking about going from a team that were looking to cling on to a playoff place last season to a team that are, hopefully looking to win promotion this year and do it automatically. And they're the little things that are going to take them above the likes of a Forest Green, a Carlisle, a York, and so on, who do have the additional money to spend. And yeah, it's those little things that are going to give them that bit of an edge. And they've now beaten Forest Green, Carlisle, and Boreham Wood on the road. There's a reason for that.
I think Ryan makes a good point there, actually, that last year, I think one of my biggest criticisms, and I said it at the start of the season, was that last year Rochdale were a little bit too nice. They're a really good passing team, but you almost felt if we can get physical with them, we'll probably get something from the game. And that's obviously what Southend did in that semi-final to get through. And I think what they've done this summer is add that little bit of nastiness to them. I think people always look down at that and say, that's the dark arts and, teams shouldn't be doing that. But ultimately, teams that win leagues do that. And they've added that this year. So, yeah.
I think as well, Jim McNulty, for me, is someone that I do feel is undervalued in this division as a manager. I suppose there are certain things at times in specific games, even going to last season as well, where you'd be a bit like, that's quite a strange decision. And of course, the times where he's kind of made those, surprising or controversial decisions in terms of the tactical side of things, we always focus on the times it's not worked rather than potentially the times where we haven't noticed it, but it has worked, if that makes sense, where he's been quite ruthless in, and not being afraid to make quite unpopular decisions in terms of the team selection overall. But I suppose for me, particularly in the Rochdale fan base as well, I get the impression that they feel like, anyone would have been able to get the best out of this squad. And I have to disagree, because I look at the style of football. I know they're gifted with a lot of great talent, not just in the forward line in the likes of Disaruvway and Rodney, but from the defence with the likes of Beckwith, going into that midfield with Easton Gilmore as well. There's quality all over the field. But I do feel like the style of football suits all those players, and that's something that Jim McNulty, of course, brings to the team, and a style that he's trying to implement there, or not just trying to, but that's clearly working and being very effective. Do you agree that at times he gets quite a lot of unnecessary stick? Of course, there's things that I've looked at, if you go back to that Halifax game or even the Brackley game, where he's made some rather controversial decisions and they've not came off, or do you think that genuinely he's really just undervalued?
I wouldn't say undervalued. I think people appreciate the job he's done. I think certainly last year, I think some of the frustration that Rochdale fans had was that they dominated games and they had a lot of the ball, but perhaps didn't create enough chances with that dominance. Whereas I think this year he's made one or two subtle tweaks. Obviously, he's looked to go a little bit more direct at times into Desiree way and get runners in around him. So they haven't been as dominant with the ball, but equally have been effective in the final third. I wasn't wholly subscribed to the view that the changes against Brackley was that much of a deal. Ultimately, if you win the game afterwards and put a run of games together, then the fact he made the changes, it gives him a chance to see the other players in his team over a period where it was a bank holiday. I think it was a bank holiday fixtures, wasn't it? Two games in very quick succession, and they had won the game previous to that. So I don't think that there was too much wrong with that, and I think he's a good manager, and I think Rochdale fans do appreciate that. I just think, given how well he's done there as a coach, I think they probably expect, or certainly last year expected them to do what they're doing this year.
Yeah, I agree with that. Go on, Ryan, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think one of the things you can look at with McNulty as well is when you look at that midfield four, most managers in this division want midfielders that can run, that are box to box, that are big and strong and powerful. And I don't think many managers will be able to get consistently the level of performance he's got out of. It's not that these guys can't run, but they're not powerhouse midfielders in the likes of Ryan East, Aidan Barlow, Harvey Gilmore. They are relatively smaller, diminutive footballers that want to get on the ball and want to play, and probably don't want to be sprinting 60 yards back and forth to in sort of absolute chaos. I think the other thing as well is when you look at Barlow and Rodney in particular, they've undergone so many injury issues in the past that have kind of the reason they're at this level isn't because of their ability, it's because of the the injuries, are stop-start nature of their careers, and they've sort of found themselves at this level. Barlow went to Eastleigh and generally struggled to get consistent game time there, struggled to find his place. And McNulty's been patient, he's developed them, and this season they've come in, they're starting most weeks, and they look absolutely fantastic. Rodney looks like an absolute monster, and people focus on Disaruvway, and you've got Rodney sort of running in and around behind him, and it's difficult to get a hold of for teams. I think that midfield four is probably a very easy way to look at the job McNulty has done over time and prove that this isn't a case of they have a squad that's just easily good enough to win the league. This is a squad that is extremely well coached, has a lot of belief in itself and the way it plays, and there's very little criticism of McNulty, the recruitment team, or anything like that as far as I'm concerned.
Joe, I'll come to you first then. Of course, it's very early in the season, so it's very hard to kind of make judgments, and a lot of it at the moment will be based on the first 13 games or so. But who do you think Rochdale's biggest competitor is going to be this season? Of course, there's a lot of sides you can mention, but just what you're thinking at the moment, and as the season goes on, who do you feel will be the biggest competitor for Rochdale this season?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I think it's probably between three teams for me. And I think I would still be inclined to stick with York over 46 games. Obviously, I picked them to win the league before a ball was kicked. I think most people picked them to do that. And yes, there has been one or two, question marks over York since Stuart Maynard's come in. But I think on the whole, it's been a good appointment. They've had some good wins. And they've got a fantastic squad. And they haven't really got going yet, and they're still in and around it. And given York's size and the ambition there, obviously with the Uglers, they will spend, if they are in and around it, come the final sort of third of the season. So I think they're a very, very talented squad. Obviously with Ollie Pearce, you're always going to have a chance of winning games. And I think you almost don't have to be at your best if you've got Ollie Pearce, because he can win a game just out of the blue. So I would still pick York. I think I got asked this a couple of weeks ago, and I would still pick York. Yes, they've obviously had one or two hiccups, and they would be expected to be the team that have started the best and racing away. But I still think they've got that experience that they added in the summer, and the quality and the goals to be the biggest challenger to Rochdale.
There's three sides for me specifically that I think have stood out so far, and that would be Rochdale, Forest Green, and Boreham Wood. They're the three at the moment that I think are able to compete. In terms of York, they've took, of course, 15 points from their opening 8 games under Stuart Maynard, which is just short of 2 points per game, which, over the course of the season, that's 92 points, isn't it, in 46 games. So for me, overall, I think they'll only get better as well. I think there's been a lot of fixtures where I think as time goes on, you'll look at those games and be like, yeah, they probably would have won those games if Stuart Maynard was more, settled into the job there, if that makes sense. So I'm definitely not writing York off. They were my side I thought would win the league before a ball was kicked. And I think it'd be silly to just say, based on the opening third of the season, to just ultimately say, no, I don't think they're going to win the league, because I still think on paper that squad will. And I think over time they will get better and better, and will be able to compete with those three sides. And potentially when you look at someone like Boreham Wood, maybe the strength in depth isn't there like it is with a York or a Rochdale potentially, and that might be their downfall, where they get weaker as the season goes on, in my opinion. As for you, Ryan, then, who do you think Rochdale's biggest competitor will be this season?
It's still difficult to say because of how tight things are towards the top. I think Forest Green are obviously the obvious one. Forest Green are the obvious ones. They're right behind them. They've only lost one game this season, which was against the team that are now top of the league. My main concern at the start of the season with Forest Green was, although they've got experience in the group, they've got most of their signings in the summer were very inexperienced on the whole. And it's a bit of a different dynamic across the board, and I'm curious to see how that begins to play out now. They've not just lost one game, have they? They've lost one game, but they've come up short in a couple of others where they've faced teams that have just defended the box really well and sort of hit them on the break every so often. The underlying numbers are fantastic, but I'm curious to see how things develop as they sort of reach these winter months. They looked a little. It wasn't an awful performance yesterday, but there's just an element of chaos with Forest Green that makes me uneasy when I watch them. But again, I'm nitpicking because on the whole they are a very, very good side, and I think it's just kind of looking for that perfection, I guess, when you're looking for a title winner. York, similar thought. Fantastic squad. They're already picking up points. Similar to last season, it's just whether they can cut out the silliness in games where they just don't need to be silly. They've conceded 3 goals against Scunthorpe at home. Absolutely battered Solihull Moors and lost by one breakaway at the end. Just the silly things that cost them last year. I think I said they had a run last year of, I think it was 12 games across the winter or something, or 12 or 15 games or something along those lines, where they conceded 2 goals in those games. They conceded 2 goals in 10 games out of about 22 across the winter is the stat. They lost 7 of those games, and that was ultimately what cost them in the race against Barnet. And they've already done that on a couple of occasions this season. They have to cut that out if they're going to bridge that gap between themselves and the top of the division. Carlisle are very much in and around it. My main concern with them is I'm not sure, again, being ultra critical, because I think they'll end up in the playoffs. I don't know if Mark Hughes is going to get enough out of that squad to elevate it above the sum of its parts. I think they are relying on a bit of individualism across the board. He's already made sort of chopping and changing things every so often. I think they're very reliant on Linney, Armstrong and Kelly, and obviously Armstrong and Kelly don't play together that much. So I think it's either they find the perfect player that sort of complements those two and gives them a more varied threat, or those two are going to be the reason they get to where they get to. And then looking outside the sort of the 3 bigger money clubs, Scunthorpe and Boreham Wood, it's just whether they've got, when push comes to shove, are they going to have the squad to be able to compete with the other four that have got, huge squads, huge experience, huge, levels of quality of players that have played at higher levels and so on. And yeah, Southend were probably the other team that had maybe pitched up there towards the start of the season, but they can't seem to get away from these, niggly 1-1, 2-0 losses, and just probably aren't quite ruthless enough. So yeah, I think the boring answer is I'm probably pitching the three sides that are, have probably got the money behind them. And, it's not the most exciting answer in the world, but ultimately this is the way the National League works. At times it is the sides that have the money that end up leading towards the top because they can constantly evolve throughout the season. Yeah, I wouldn't want to choose who's going to win the league, but I think it might end up being those four that are very much up there.
Yeah, I think we've all got quite, and based on your kind of facial expression as well, Joe, I'm taking that we've all got a similar kind of opinion on Carlisle United. I know for me, I totally agree with what you've said there. I'd actually say I think they rely very heavily on Regan Linney himself. I watch highlights of games, even when he's not actually scoring, it feels like he's the one making the goals for Carlisle United. I know against Scunthorpe, it came from a set piece, didn't it? However, I know they were 1-0 up before Scunthorpe went down to 10 men, but after that, even with Scunthorpe with 10 men, Scunny were very, very unfortunate not to get anything out of that game, in my opinion, overall. But I do think we have to give Carlisle credit for that win, no matter how it came about. They're the first side, of course, to defeat Scunthorpe this season. But there's just something about me with them, and I've watched them a few times, and I've kind of mentioned it up quite a lot on the podcast recently, is it's not just defensively. I know they've got Feeney back now in that defensive side of things. I still feel like other partner with him. I still think they need to be looking to find that perfect replacement, that perfect player to play alongside him. But, you go into the midfield, I feel like there's been a lot of games, even the Scunthorpe game, where they've kind of been bullied in the midfield and outrun, in my opinion. And then, although they've scored quite a lot of goals, I'd say going forward, they're very reliant on Regan Linney to create everything for them. And I do think they'll be in the playoffs. And I know you mentioned there they kind of need that perfect player, don't they? But, like I said, with Rochdale, that missing piece in the jigsaw. For me, the missing piece for Carlisle United would probably definitely be Chris Clark, because I've said it on a few of the podcasts. It feels like, particularly the better sides in the division, they're catching on to marking out Regan Linney in games, which of course leaves space, in that midfield if they're too busy marking him on the wing. But there's no one in the midfield in that number 10 role that's really stepping up for me. And if you add Chris Clark into that position, they're going to score a lot more goals and create a lot more issues for teams. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think he'd be a decent signing. Obviously, I think there's actually a team that in the National League which he'd be better suited for. Personally, I think he'd be a better fit for Altrincham for what they need at the moment. Spoke to a couple of people when Altrincham came to Yeovil the other week, and they said that's exactly the sort of person they're missing in terms of somebody that can play sort of a freer role in behind a striker that perhaps works hard, like a Knowles, that can just knit everything together and unlock that door. For me, I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of the midfield. I think I look at Ryan mentioned it with Rochdale and their four midfielders that they've got in there. For me, I think, yes, you can have, good goalkeeper, good centre forward. For me, I think the most important position in the National League for teams consistently that have won it is those two in midfield. And if those two, I call it the box, if that box is not right, then you ain't going to win the league. And unfortunately for me, I look at that midfield for Carlisle and I don't see enough in there, A, to control games, but B, to then actually then go and, force games in their favour in terms of winning the ball back and opening doors. Hence why obviously there's been a lot of emphasis on the likes of Linney to not only score the goals but to create the goals as well. So for me that's the most important thing for them.
Yeah, I think with Carlisle, my general thoughts are I don't think whether the squad is better than every other team at the level is up for debate. I think my concern is, and again, I'm being ultra critical because we are talking about winning the league and, almost perfection rather than, just a top 3, top 5 finish kind of thing. I think it's whether you've got people in that building that are going to raise the level from there to there, and I think we saw a little bit with Mark Hughes at Bradford, where Andy Cook was scoring goals left, right, and centre, but beyond that, they didn't have the same level of threat across the pitch. And I think they play. It's not an awful style. They've got a decent setup. They've got a fairly well balanced team. I just don't know if they've got that thing about them, whether it's a tactical nous, whether it's a leadership, whether it's but whatever it is, I just feel like there's something missing that takes them from being a very good team at the level to a top team at the level. And I'm not 100% convinced that Mark Hughes is going to get that out of them. Probably, maybe to an extent, a little bit like Steve Cottrell at Forest Green last year, where the squad on the pitch is genuinely excellent, but having that bit that takes you from where Forest Green ended up to where Barnet and York ended up. I think that could be the difference between them being fighting for a top 3 space and fighting for an automatic spot. I think that's where I see it. I don't necessarily think they need to go out and buy 4 or 5 more players to make themselves a better team. I do actually think the answers are probably within the building, maybe one addition. You look at their defensive four, Mugabe, Thomas, Hayden and Fina. You could argue there's probably not a better foursome at the level in terms of centre-halves. I think the answers might be in the building. It's just whether they've got enough about them. Management team, players, coaching, tactics, whatever it is, just to pull themselves that little bit level higher. And I'm not convinced they've got that. And I think that might be the thing that drags them down.
I think before a ball was kicked, in terms of those centre-halves, likes of Terrell Thomas, Aaron Hayden, and Feeney and Mugabe as well, I totally agree with you. But when I've actually watched them in games, it feels like they're getting cut open. The likes of Terrell Thomas himself, and that partnership together. Maybe it's not actually about and I might actually be agreeing with you here. Maybe it's more not just about the actual individuals themselves. It's about creating that perfect partnership. And it feels like at the moment they've been altering a lot, haven't they, with those two centre halves? And even at times with Halifax over the last couple of years, I'm saying Halifax because we've been very strong defensively over the last couple of years. When we've been at our best defensively, it's when we've had that settled back 4 or back 5. And that is something with Carlisle United this season. They haven't had that settled back 5. It feels like every week they're changing. And of course, at times, that's not always actually been Mark Hughes' fault. It's been down to injuries. But I feel like if they want him to step up now, they need to get that settled back, those two centre-half settled. And that would likely be Feeney for me. And to be honest, I'd have Aaron Hayden with him at the moment because although I know he gets a lot of criticism. I know he did score at the weekend, but he gets a lot of criticism, but I still look back at his time when he was at Wrexham and when he was fully fit, and I thought he was one of the best centre-halves in the division last time he was in this division. But of course, this season he has been known to make a couple of mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me personally, I think, as you say, that as a 4, a fairly decent crop. I certainly would still have Hayden as a decent centre-half. I think if you were to offer any manager in the National League, I think a fair few of them would take Hayden when he's fit. But again, for me, it comes down to that midfield. If you've got no protection in front of you, then your defence is going to look worse than it actually is. Like I look at the teams that are struggling down the bottom this year. For example, Woking. Woking have got good centre-halves, but they're struggling because their midfield is poor this year. They're missing Dale Gorman. They're missing someone in that midfield. You look at Truro. They've got good centre-halves. They were brilliant last year, but their midfield has been ripped apart. And having seen, through my own team, having seen my team get relegated out of the division because we had a midfield that was non-existent with some really good centre-halves, for me, I think that's the one thing that midfield, if you can't get that right, then you're on a hide into nothing, really. Hence why you look at, say, Scunthorpe and Bournemouth, the two teams that have really surprised people this year. Scunthorpe with Beeston and Ewing in midfield and Bournemouth with White and Brunt. They've got those midfield 2 sorted and they look a much better team for it. So, yeah, I think it's about finding that partnership in midfield that works, that then gives that protection to that back four, to me.
We'll show you how to get 51% off the RRP of the Sum Up Air. With no contracts or monthly fees and a low 1.69% per transaction, this handy device makes it easy to accept all card payments. Simply visit www.sumup.co.uk/cards-accepted and click Order Now. Link also in description. Free shipping and 30-day money-back guarantee.
Now, I've got a few questions kind of that I'd like to ask you both here now. We've got biggest overachievers so far, the most underwhelming, the next manager to be sacked, and I think we're also going to do the best individual in the National League so far this season. I want to start things off with the most underwhelming though. This season. Joe, I'll come to you first. Who's been the biggest disappointment for you so far in this National League season?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it'll be between two. I'm going to discount Eastleigh because I think, given the managerial things that have happened, I think really decent squad. There's a couple of players in that I really like, but I think they'll be okay. For me, I think you'd probably have to look at Sutton. They were the team that I had in and around the playoffs before a ball was kicked. A team that I really like, got lots of quality in it. Perhaps on the younger side than you would perhaps want, but certainly a decent enough side. And they've really struggled. Obviously, Morrison losing his job, going with Chris Agato, obviously we'll come on to later. And certainly you would have thought that they could have perhaps kicked on from last season. And then the other one is, I know obviously Ryan backs them every year to be in there, and it's Altrincham for me. It just seems like something's just not right at Altrincham. Don't know what, but obviously they have had a couple of injuries. But for a team that have always been on that edge of the playoffs or just inside, this year they've just dropped off, only just above the drop zone. They're lacking that creativity that you would normally associate with a Phil Parkinson team. Obviously, they lost a lot of quality in the summer, the likes of Newby, Amaluza, Linney, etc. And they've perhaps not replaced it as you would hope for. But yeah, for me, I think obviously, I think when I spoke to quite a lot of the Altrincham fans last week when they played Yeovil, I think they were a little bit worried. Couple of poor results, and suddenly they're looking over their shoulder at the wrong end of the table. And yeah, I think that's the one team that you would look at and feel, yeah, they've really underachieved, because Phil Parkinson's been a really consistently good coach at this level, and I think he is still a very good coach. But ultimately, we're not seeing the fruits of that on the pitch.
Costa winless in 7, aren't they? I will allude to the fact that in those 7 games they've played 4 of the top 7. But I've always felt like with Altrincham, particularly in the last couple of years, they want to be competing with those, for those playoff spots. And based on, these set of results, they certainly won't be. And of course, if you actually look at their current position in the table, they currently sit 20th, just 1 point above the drop zone at the moment. I know you alluded to significant injuries there to Altrincham players, and I think that is a massive factor so far, because they've been very light, haven't they, going into games. I think in certain games so far this season they've not even been able to name a full bench. And I suppose with Altrincham, a club like them, they have to take chances on potentially injury prone players. I think Oliver Crankshaw's a prime example of that. For me, he's a very talented individual. I think Stockport fans highly rated him, but his downfall throughout his whole career has been injuries. And you look at last season, that seemed to be an issue for him, and certainly this season when he needs to step up, I suppose, and be that newbie of last season, he hasn't been able to due to the amount of injuries he's had.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll be the worry for Parkinson, is that when you're relying on players within the team that perhaps do have 1 or 2 injuries. Obviously, when they played Yeovil, they played Matty Kozlow, who himself has been out with injuries last season. Obviously, Crankshaw wasn't in the squad that game, and has had his injury problems. And obviously, Ethan Ross as well hasn't featured much this year. So, yeah, it's been a tough season. But I think they'll ultimately be fine because I put a lot of stock in the quality of Phil Parkinson as a coach. And I think they are a pretty well-run club at this level. Albeit, I think for where they have been so far, I think they'll be quite disappointed with their start.
Ryan, for you then, who's been the most underwhelming side so far this season?
I've got the same two as Joe. Admittedly, I did put both these in my playoff positions in the summer, so there probably is an element of that. But I think with Sutton, I regret not. When Sutton started making their transfers at the start of the summer, I turned round and said mid-table again. Fallon was essentially just going for the same strategy, and then as the summer went on, I got that. I mean, I don't know how you guys felt so putting your table together, but I wanted to. It felt like someone was going to break in. It didn't feel like there was an obvious club that were going to break into that top. Well, I suppose really the top five. I had, Rochdale, Carlisle, Forest Green, York, Southend, and it was who else is going to finish in the top seven. And yeah, I ended up throwing Sutton in fifth, and it was just a bit of a gut feeling. Looking at it almost immediately as soon as the ball is kicked and you see the 11 and you go, very young squad. Almost feels like a lot of their issues have been self-inflicted again. They lost the players that played most for them last season on the whole. They don't, Ashley Addison had a very good season last year, but he wasn't the main striker. And all of a sudden he's the main striker, so they've lost a bit more of attacking threat. Constantly being caught out in exactly the same way down the side of the wide centre backs and being pulled out. And it just feels so self-inflicted in terms of the way their season's unfolded so far. To be fair, and I wrote a piece on this, I think Steve Morrison was a broken man by the end of it. He was talking in a way that it just looked like he didn't know the answers essentially, and had reached that point of almost feeling sorry for the group, feeling sorry for his coaching staff. Everyone's giving everything and it's just not working, and he ended up leaving. Obviously, again, as mentioned, we'll get to Chris Agatha. But it just feels like so many of the issues are self-inflicted there, and I think that's what disappoints me. With Altrincham, they've actually been a decent side this season, which is kind of the problem. Their underlying numbers are amongst the better teams in the division. They're probably a top 5, top 6 teams in terms of those underlying numbers, how much they're creating, how much they're giving up. There is an argument around, they've got a very brand new front line. They began the season with no centre backs. Sam Barnes was a late addition. Dan Sassy signed just before opening day. Lewis Baines has come back in. Jake Cooper's half featuring now. They've lost the goalkeeper, so there is a bit of an issue at both ends of the pitch, which is probably contributing to it. My main concern is I try and listen to all the major interviews, and Phil Parkinson's always had this way of, he'll try and dampen expectations and try and keep things on the low. Maybe it's just against the results, but it feels like there's a very worries me about the way he talks. And I just want to see that real, push and to talk a bit braver. Not everything is you look at, I think even when they played Yeovil the other week, he was talking about, the fact that they've got all these fantastic options off the bench. And admittedly, he's a little bit short at the moment, but they have similar levels of talent, and you don't have to stand there and talk up Yeovil's options off the bench in order to acknowledge the fact that I haven't seen the game, I'll be honest, but I'm assuming, again, they've probably put up decent numbers, fallen the wrong side of the margins once again. And, that's all you need to talk about. You don't need to bring this whole worries me, because all it does is it makes it sound as though you've brought in players over the summer that aren't ready or aren't good enough to play at this level, and they are a little bit raw, and you probably aren't going to meet the numbers that you're creating and not giving up. But yeah, I'd just like to see him be a little bit braver in the way he talks. They have a good team. They are playing really good stuff. Let's just try and focus on that. It will improve, not the, oh, we've got a young group, or we haven't got that much money. We haven't got these options. We haven't got this. This team have got that. Let's just try and flip that narrative around. And that probably is there's an experience element. There's a reason things are happening as they are. But when you listen to an Adam Lakeland, Andy Butler, Luke Gerard, there's almost no real excuses there. And maybe that is because they're winning football matches. But it feels a little bit less like they're, looking at the bigger clubs up above them, or the schedule or everything like that, and going, oh, it's a little bit tough for teams like us, isn't it? It's right, let's bring on the next one. And I think I just want to see a little bit more out of that out of Parkinson, and whether that just changes the narrative a little bit rather than, the woe is me stuff. There are understandable reasons as to why they have struggled at the times this season, but I don't think everything is a problem. Let's just see a bit more positivity out of him.
Just flipping it back to Sutton, of course, they've recently appointed a new manager in Chris Aguta, the previous Worthing manager. Do you think he's the perfect man for them, that's going to be able to get Sutton, back on a roll, or potentially, back where a lot of people expect them before a ball was kicked? Of course, it feels like they're quite far off now, aren't they, being on the fringes of the playoffs? But it's a very long season, and we have seen in the past teams be in Sutton's position, and come the end of the season, they've been very close, or even been able to break into the top 7. Do you think there's that potential there with him now to be able to at least maybe stabilise them in the National League, rather than being in the bottom 4? Of course, they've only had one victory all season, that ironically actually came against Carlisle.
Yeah, it's a difficult one with Chris. I think he's a very good coach. And I actually talked on NL Full Time earlier that I actually think for the squad that he inherits at Sutton, I think he's a fantastic choice, because I think there's a lot of young players there that need really, really good coaching, which perhaps at times didn't reflect on the pitch under Morrison. And I think in Agatha, they've got a really, really good coach. That's one thing that Worthing are really good at, is they identify really good coaches. So I think he's a good fit for that squad. I think he would be a better fit for Sutton if he'd been coming in a summer where he'd been able to implement his ideas and have more time to work with the players. Albeit he's coming into a season where he'll probably want to be playing a pretty decent brand of football like he did at Worthing, and he's then got the added pressure of having to get results straight from the off. So I think it's a difficult one for Chris. I think, he's definitely earned his stripes to manage at this level, and I think in time he'll be a really good manager at this level. It's whether he can make a quick start, because if he can't, then I think that's when you struggle. But I think he's a good coach, good guy. Spoken to a couple of times, and he always speaks well. And he will really relish that job, because no doubt good coaches going into teams where they realise, cool, I'd really like to work with him, get the best out of him and develop him as a player. I think he'll really enjoy that. It's whether or not he can hit the ground running, and potentially whether he can go out and get one or two experienced faces to add to that team. Because I think if you were to add 2 or 3 experienced players in the spine of the team around the sort of younger quality, I think you'd look at that Sutton team a very different team as they are now.
I think a key start for Sutton is going to be crucial, isn't it? They're already 5 points adrift away from safety at the moment, so there really is no room for error there. I think from the off, they're going to have to start picking up results under the new manager. Of course, after the FA Cup break, they've got Hartlepool at home coming up before having to face Wealdstone away, and then Eastleigh. So out of those 3 games, they're 3 quite awkward fixtures. I'd say Hartlepool will want a reaction. I always see them as quite a hard team to beat, and then you've got Wealdstone, who started very well before playing Eastleigh, who are under a new manager now. And for me personally, I'm pretty confident that Eastleigh will be able to pick up, under him as well. Ryan, quickly, what's your thoughts then on the new Sutton manager?
just quickly, I think that
Yeah.
Sutton Hartlepool game is one I might sit and watch. That's got all the ingredients there. I'll be honest, I don't know an awful lot about a gutter. I don't get the time to sit and watch the North and South as much as I'd love to. I think a fresh voice will probably help. He's also brought his assistant across, hasn't he? And John Meany's got him. Maybe just a fresh voice will help in terms of just tuning the players back in. I don't think there's ever been an issue with work ethic or anything like that at Sutton. I think it's just structural things and just it's fine margins within games that are just costing them more often than not. And it's just about a little bit of structure, a little bit more of a different idea, perhaps, and they might start moving forward. The thing that caught my eye over the weekend was him saying that's the worst. That's the worst that Sutton will play under him in that draw against Braintree. I think Pitt also alluded to the fact that they were probably the better side in the game as well. So, big words to start with. Probably a intentionally strong start in terms of talking post-match to, G people up and basically start saying, standards are going to be better, the team's going to improve. All about backing up on paper now and seeing how things go from there, really.
Looking at the next manager then who could potentially be let go in the National League, just to let you both know, you can kind of link it to the same club in any of these questions. For me, I probably wouldn't actually use any of those clubs because I think a lot of them have got new managers, particularly in Sutton. I'll start with you, Joe. Who do you think will be the next manager to be booted out of the door then in the National League?
Yeah, cheers, Luke. You give me the good one. It's tough, isn't it? Because I look at the teams down the bottom, and I obviously Sutton have only just appointed a new manager. Likewise, Solihull Moors. I don't think Morecambe will make a change because I think they're very much, in on that experiment. Even though Truro have not started as they would, I think they will back Askey to the hilt because they know that he's the biggest ticket they've got to potentially staying in this league, which makes you having to look higher in the league as to a manager that could get sacked. And I think I would probably look at Hartlepool if it doesn't continue as it has done, if it continues as it has done, because I thought that they signed some really good players in the summer. I know, obviously, I think the Hartlepool fans have already turned on quite a few of them in terms of not thinking they're up to it. But I think they've got a decent enough squad. Yes, they're not particularly scoring that many goals, but not conceding that many either. And obviously, they've already made a change in the coaching staff with the assistant Neil McDonald leaving today, which is a bit of a shock. Elliot Dickman, who was manager of South Shields but last year, he's come in as the new assistant. And I think, I think Hartlepool are a club that are very vocal, their supporter base. So I think if there is going to be a change, I think that's the one team that I think potentially could make that change. Because I look at all the teams down there, like, for example, Aldershot. I know people can call him for Widgerton, which I think is ridiculous, to be honest. He's got more players out injured than he has even available to him. And he's had 2 seasons of absolutely brilliant football and success at Aldershot. So, I think probably Hartlepool.
I think there's a lot of issues behind the scenes, isn't there? I know it's not a very good relationship between the owner and the supporters, and as well, the owner at Hartlepool is quite renowned for not being afraid to sack managers. I think last season they must have made a change at least twice, maybe even 3 times last season, and they always disappoint me, Hartlepool, in the last couple of years. You can kind of let them off that first season coming down because it's always hard to readjust back to the National League, isn't it, after you've just fallen out of the Football League. But I felt like after that they'd really kick on and be able to push into the playoffs. Of course, they didn't last season, even though I think on paper they had a very good squad. And, this season as well, I thought, although they lost 1 or 2 key players in the summer, I thought they made some very good replacements. And I like the project under Grayson, but it just does seem to be like more of the same there. Ryan, coming to you then, who do you see as the next manager to face the boot in the National League?
Firstly, I kind of hope none of them, because I
Yeah.
don't like putting this sort of thing forward. But if we're being perfectly honest, I'm again aligning with Joe, and it's why I mentioned earlier about Sutton v Hartlepool being quite an interesting game, because you've got essentially new manager bounce against will it be his first home league game as well, possibly against the Hartlepool United side, who are awkward opponents to face, but also their manager is going to find himself under increasing pressure because of what Hartlepool tend to be like as a club. Obviously, change of coaching staff, as Joe mentioned. Feeling very Darren Soul-like, where they're okay as a team, but just not quite making the most of those fine margins again. And the fact that he keeps chopping and changing the team and changing the shape and so on. Started without a striker the other day. Just feels like he doesn't really, either he doesn't know his best team, or he's kind of losing faith with individuals quite quickly, and it's never a good sign. I did write a few of the managers down. I know Joe's touched on a couple of them. Obviously with John Askey, it's a case of I don't know how lofty Truro's ambitions are. I know they went full time this summer, so if they do feel like they're in trouble, do they pull the trigger potentially? Phil Parkinson in a similar boat, and again, I don't think it's a performance issue. I think it's more they brought in new investment in the summer. So again, if things get a little bit dicey, the people that are putting the investment sort of turn around and say, actually, we want more, we want better than this. We don't want to go down this route. Widrington has mentioned. The only thing I can think there is just it's the same problems over and over and over again. Mentioned defensive injuries. They've had defensive injuries for years now, and I think it is partly due to the style they play. The defenders get dragged around left, right, and centre, and it reminds me a little bit of when I watched Blues under Lee Bowyer, where you're asking defenders to do things that they're not normally built for. You're asking 6'2", 6'3" guys to be sprinting 50 yards up and down the pitch, turning quickly and stuff, because the system itself is general chaos, and it's a lot of fun. The thing I get the impression with Widrington and Aldershot, though, is that he is a big bonus in terms of the money they're bringing in, because they keep signing these young players and selling them on. So I'd imagine so long as they keep bringing in the money in that sense, there's a benefit to the chaos, really. And Neil Ardley's the other one as well. And again, I think they've had a slow burn of a campaign. I think Hardley mentioned it as well. They kind of purposely chose to keep the powder dry with regards to a couple of signings. They brought in Kelly late, they brought in Forster Caskey late, and just made the decision to hold fire with a couple of things which left them short at the start of the season. But again, it's another one of those situations where, if things don't improve over the next month or so and they're still in and around it, despite performances not actually being terrible on the whole, does a decision get made? But I think with those four, there's plenty of reasons for them to stick in a job, whereas I think Hartlepool do have that itchy trigger finger. I know Darren Saul got sacked last year after the FA Cup. Was it the first round or qualifying round? They lost to Brackler after a fairly decent start, low margin start, and then results started to turn. And John Asker the year before had a really good start, and then things just dropped off a cliff, and he was sacked pretty quickly afterwards. So yeah, I think Grayson's the one that probably stands out, particularly given half the division have already changed the majors anyway.
Yeah, like I said earlier, there's been a lot of changes, hasn't there, in the National League? Yeovil, although it's probably not been ideal, it's not really as plain as it might look. They've, of course, had to change their manager twice now in the National League. Of course, Morecambe, I think a lot of people will look in there and look at the results and look at some of the players on paper, and will obviously just say them, I think, at the moment. I am slightly surprised, even if you had said that. I know there's quite a deep project there, isn't there, with the owners, but I think, in my opinion, I actually agree in terms of I don't think they're going to change, because I think the owners are very deep into the project there. But I just look at it now, 11 games gone, and they've conceded 33 goals. They're averaging to concede 3 goals a game. And in terms of a supporter base as well, they will be demanding to stay up now. I know early on in the season when all the ownership issues were happening, before they'd actually started the campaign, there was that thought of, well, at least we've got a football club. I'm not really that bothered if we stay up. But time moves very quickly in football. We've seen at Southend in the past, when they were struggling at times in the season, a lot of their supporters were actually asking Kevin Mayer to actually be sacked, of course, based on the playoffs last season. I think a lot of them kind of ate their words, I suppose. But, just looking at that and then looking at Morecambe's situation, I think a lot of the supporters are certainly turning against the manager at the moment because there's on paper, quite a good squad there. And at the moment, they are getting thumped in a lot of these games at the moment. Do you guys, I suppose, in your opinion, if you were the owner of Morecambe, I'll change the question about, would you be looking at making a decision in terms of finding someone else? Starting with you, Ryan.
It's a difficult one to answer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you know what intrigued me yesterday? And I'm just double checking this before I say it. They lost the left back, didn't they? And because they lost the left back, they brought in Francelet to play centre half, moved Songo into the defensive midfield position, and it looks like they pushed Aziz on. I haven't seen any of the games, so that could be not how it played out, but I'm looking at the 11, it looks as if that was the case. I know there's been calls from the fan base that Aziz is a wonderful player, but needs some proper defensive support next to him. I think the thing I'm intrigued about is whether that was just a case of, because Kane had to go from the, sort of attacking 8 position to left back, was that just a case of, I've got to pick the next best player that I can bring into the team, and therefore, Songo can drop in there? Or was it a conscious decision to say, we're conceding too many goals, let's push you forward a bit because you're a quality player, and let's just try and get a bit more resilience? And they drew 1-1. And, it could be Tamworth have played a lot of games in a short space of time as a part-time team. They probably weren't at it. Again, I haven't seen the stats, but I'm just intrigued as to whether that's Jahal trying to address the problem that they have, or whether it is just, as soon as the left back's back and available again, they kind of go the same way and continue the same problems. I can't remember the exact quote. Did he say the end of October was when they will be up and fully running and fully fit and winning games again, or along those lines? Because if it's the end of October, then I'm kind of willing to give them another 4 weeks and see if we do see improvement. If I was the owner, I probably wouldn't have gone down this route in the first place. So it's a bit of a difficult question to answer, really. I'd have gone for tried and tested, but I do quite like the fact that they've gone for the ballsy decision. They're playing a fun brand of football. They've brought in some excellent players. You can quite tell they just threw a load of players at it to begin with, and they've addressed the problems they have. They've brought in quality footballers for the level. So I'm just intrigued to see how it develops from looking what is a genuinely excellent footballing team when they get the ball down and start playing and causing, creating chances, and the wingers are scoring unbelievable goals. Just, can they learn enough? You don't have to change your principles completely in order to make the team a better team defensively. And it's just whether they can find a bit of structure within this sort of framework now, just to make themselves a little harder to beat. And I think that's probably going to be the challenge over the next month or so. If they end up getting, spanked 4s and 5s for the next month again, then there probably is a conversation to be had there, because it would be quite clear that he's just not learning from the mistakes.
Joes, for you then?
Yeah, I agree with Ryan, to be honest. I would be interested to see where we are in a couple of weeks, whether or not they've had another couple of games where they've shipped a couple of goals, or whether there has been improvement. I agree with Ryan, and I hope the Songo into midfield is the answer. To me, he's never been a centre-back. He's always better as a 6, always been throughout his career better in that deeper role. And it also then gives you your license, because as Ryan says, they have got some good attacking players, and they do play some nice football. So that certainly as a team would sound like a better proposition. Yeah, obviously they've gone down the route that they have. I wouldn't have gone down it like what Ryan has said. Obviously they've not made the appointment for his startling managerial record because he's not been a manager. And he's obviously shown that he can attract some good players. And you would hope that if they can sharpen up at the back and continue the way they're playing going forward, there's the basis there for them to be a decent side in this league. But they've got to start winning some games, because there's no point getting to the end of October and still being in this position, and they're suddenly 10 points adrift, and then it's we're starting to get cut adrift even in October. So they've got to start winning some games of football. And Morecambe have got to be brave, because ultimately, if they aren't brave and they don't make the right decision, they'll be playing National League North football next year. So yes, it's always great having good intentions to begin with and a nice fancy project that seems great if it goes well, but you've got to be realistic of where they are. And ultimately they could be a month down the road and even more in the what's it. So yeah, they've just got to be mindful of where they are at the moment and be a bit more realistic.
Moving on then to the biggest overachievers this season. There's three for me that stand out that are quite shocking, and I mean they look very, very bad. Joe, I remind you of it every single podcast, so I do apologise. But when I come on to this question, I've got to mention it. Of course, there's one obvious one for you. You're not alone either, because I wasn't too far off putting them in a similar position to you. Yeah, who's been the biggest overachievers for you then, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose against my own expectations, probably Scunthorpe, because obviously they have started the season brilliantly, albeit I think the concerns that I did raise in the summer, going on what Andy Butler said and what the fans were saying, I think it's probably not played out. The fact that he was quite bullish in pre-season. Mason Campbell is going to be my number one. He's only played 5 games. They've come up, they've played a completely different system to what they had in the National League North, which I suppose is difficult to anticipate. And they have taken a gamble on a couple of players. I think for me, the one that has really impressed me, they're well ahead of where I thought they would be, is Wealdstone. They obviously signed a fairly they stuck to one type of profile in the summer, which is basically anybody over 6'4". Obviously they've built a really physical team, really hard-working team. Obviously Sam Cox coming back in there. And I think if you were to say to any Wealdstone fan that after 14 games, so virtually a third of the season, that they'd be sitting 10th and only 3 points off the playoffs, they'd have absolutely snapped their hand off with that. I think they're going to get better as well. Obviously, they've added a couple of additions, the likes of Olamola recently, who's come in. And yeah, they look a decent side. You're never going to get the best technical quality with Wealdstone, because they don't have the budget to go out and get the best technical players, because they're usually the ones that demand the most money. But I think for what Wealdstone have, I think they've been really good. Just really difficult to beat. They've adapted in games, and Sam Cox has impressed me, because obviously his first time round, I think it's very easy to come in as a manager when your backs are against the wall and you've got to just win games and there's pressure on. He obviously then went to Oxford City and that didn't go very well, but he's come in and he looks like a manager that's certainly learned from the last 18 months for his time at Oxford City, and Wealdstone are now all the better for it.
Yeah, I mentioned 3 there. That's a 4th, by the way, because I had them to go down. I don't just mean in terms of teams' placements either. I mean how they're actually competing for the table, competing in the table. I should say in specific games as well. You look at Wealdstone. I thought they'd really struggle, and they seem to be grinding out results. And at the moment, this is the time of the season, I feel, where you really need to be getting as far away from the relegation zone as you possibly can when you're a club like Wealdstone, because it is going to get tougher as the season goes on. And so far for me, they're more than competing in this division. You know, they're currently in the top half, and they've picked some very impressive results up. You know, beating Southend, picking a point up at Scunthorpe, who are flying themselves, beating Halifax, who are currently sitting in the playoffs too. You know, they're doing more than enough for me to be able to survive in the National League this season. As for you then, Ryan, who would be yours or a couple potentially?
Sorry, on mute. I mean, Tamworth and Worldstone, although they're sort of moving towards the sort of full-time programs, you know, they remain, as I understand, semi-professional football teams. So I think every time a semi-pro team stays up in this league or, you know, performs well, I think they deserve enormous credit. The two I had down were, I mean, Scunthorpe were the obvious one. The fact that they've played 8 of the top 10 already, beating York and Southend away, they've drawn with Forest Green, they lost to Carlisle, and it sounds like they were the better team with 10 men in that game. You know, they've had an unbelievable start. Even things like, you know, the goalkeeping situation hasn't been brilliant, as Joe alluded to. I think they played Joe Starbuck at centre half in one game because they were missing Boyce or Evans. I can't remember which one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they've had to make changes, adapt. They've changed system in games depending on personnel available and so on. And yeah, deserve enormous credit for their start. And the other one is Halifax. A huge change across the season or across the summer. Change of manager, change of playing staff. Average age under the age of 24. They had the situation where they essentially had no centre half, so Josh Marmee had to drop in and play there. And they had the fullback situations too, where I think Jamie Cook and Capello started a fullback in one game. But for the most part, they've managed to find consistency in selection quite quickly, which I think is really impressive. New players have got up to speed quickly. You know, they've done Lakeland and the players have done a fantastic job there. They're moving up the league table now. Obviously beat Rochdale away, drawn at Scunthorpe, and I think they deserve huge credit for the start they've had.
I totally agree with you. As a Halifax fan myself, I think it's very exciting times ahead because, like I said, I think, you know, as you've mentioned, Joe, you know, the foundations Millington has left there, you know, were excellent. Of course, his football on paper wasn't the easiest to watch on the eye, I'll say, but it was effective football. I think he did wonders with that budget. And, you know, he's left the foundations there for a new manager to come in who potentially wants to play a more attractive style whilst also getting the results. And that's something that Adam Lakeland does. And, you know, for me, I thought Halifax would do okay this season, and of course it's very early as well, but he's surprised me once again. I think Halifax have found another gem of a manager on their hands, and as well, just from my perspective, in terms of the injuries as well that Halifax have had, the likes of, you know, the amount of centre halves that are out injured, Will Smith's been out injured, Cummings has been out injured, you know, even Florent Hottie, who before, you know, the season started, it felt like in pre-season he was going to be that kind of key man for Halifax this season. You know, after one game, well, just before the season started, he was out injured. And I think, to be fair to Halifax, they've adjusted very, very well. And at the moment, it feels like they will only get stronger with players coming back once again. I've got a final 2 questions, I think, for you. One's going to be, who do you think will have the biggest change in positions as the season goes on in a positive way? You know, potentially because a new manager's coming and you can see them improving. Who are you going to go for, Joe?
But it wasn't one of the questions that you.
No, I do apologise for that. It just come to my head, so
yeah,
I do apologise.
I'm going to go with Eastleigh. I think currently sitting 13th. Certainly the teams below them, there isn't anybody in that teams apart from maybe Solihull, with obviously one of my favourites in Millington in charge. I think Eastleigh, really like Scott Bartlett, did a great job at Western-super-Mare. I think if they can keep the 2 forwards that they've just signed on short-term deals for the duration of the season, in Kerry McGuckin and Luke Skinner, I think that along with Harvey Saunders and McCallum and Blair, you've got some real quality there. And I think it's a good squad. Hence why obviously Kelvin Davis lost his job, because they weren't performing, and they're well below where I think that they can be. I said, look, for example, at the moment they're 18 points. Well, 22 gets them into the playoffs at the moment. So, do I see Scott Bartlett giving them enough of an improvement to make up that gap over a season? Yes, I do. So, yeah, probably Eastleigh for me.
Ryan, who for you then?
I'm going to stick to my guns and say Altrincham. I've raised, obviously, my slight concerns, but I do. They're 20th at the moment and they're performing like a top 70. I do think at some point that is going to turn into results, and it's not going to be a huge issue to essentially go from 20th to 12th potentially. So yeah, I'm going to stick to my guns on that one, and think Altrincham they start pulling out victories and pull themselves up. I like the Billy Waters signing, by the way. I think that's an interesting one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree as well. I think that's that addition there. Someone, I think he fitted Altrincham perfectly. I think we all mentioned, didn't we? On our own pages in the past that Billy Waters is available. Who could he potentially go to? And I think Altrincham, it made a lot of sense geographically. I think he's based up here, isn't he now? Billy Waters, with him previously going on loan to Halifax from previously going on loan to Halifax from Wrexham, and then obviously signing for Oldham, and now of course he's back in the division at Altrincham. And with the style that Phil Parkinson likes to play, I think he should work there. I can't think of any other club who would suit as well as Altrincham at the moment. I think for me, I'm going to go different, although I do. Altrincham is probably the one for me. I'm going to go for Solihull Moors because of Chris Millington as well. I think we already saw against Eastleigh, he's making them a very hard team to beat on the opening day. Five at the back formation, that famous 5-4-1 that he likes to play. I can't see Solihull conceding many goals, and I think actually him having a more healthier budget at Solihull may mean that we see more of a more attractive style of football, because he can actually recruit better players. And that's something that I think, as we've seen at Solihull in the past, he can actually, they will actually back the manager. They certainly backed Matt Taylor in the summer. Of course, that's not worked. And I actually think Millington can get the best out of those players that Matt Taylor recruited. And once I think the Solihull board can see that, that's when I think they'll be able to, potentially help him out financially as well in terms of recruiting his own players. And based on his recruitment record at Halifax, I can see Solihull Moors, maybe not just this season, but in the future, really kicking on as a football club. And, we saw him at Halifax every season. Millington had something to play for, if that was an FA Trophy win or 2 playoff campaigns. So, it's a long season, and I wouldn't be surprised if Solihull are competing in the right direction come the end of the season. Final question then, guys, because I do understand we're getting on now. It is, who has been the best individual then in the National League this season? Maybe an obvious one.
Well, I'll perhaps leave the obvious ones to Ryan. I think I always like when you're picking a best player, I always like to try and pick someone potentially not the best, but certainly if I wanted to go and pay money to watch anybody, who would I want to go and see? I'm going to give a mention to Sam Beckwith, who I think's been phenomenal, and I think Rochdale are going to have to go up this year if they want to keep him. But the player I'm going to go for actually is a team that aren't actually in the top couple and are on the edge of the playoffs, and that's Abdul Malik, who has been ridiculous for Bournemouth. He absolutely tore Torquay apart last year in the playoffs, so I potentially got a little bit of hangover from that. But for the way Bournemouth have come into the National League and started as well as they have, they've kind of changed those wingers throughout games, but he's been the sort of one constant. And he looks, when he signed, I thought he was a little bit raw, but he's very quickly learned how to use his qualities. And under Garrard, I think he's just going to get better and better. So for me, I think in terms of individual quality, who's been the best player, I'll go with him.
Ryan, then for you, who would you go for?
Yeah, I wanted to go like Joe and not go. I mean,
obvious.
Let's just put the names out there. The obvious two are Regan Linner, who's just individual brilliance has been, a key reason as to why Carlisle are where they are in the league. And Emmanuel Dissarouwe, who has, his goals have been a big difference with regards to where Rochdale are. I pulled a face when Joe said Sam Beckwith because the player I had down was Ethan Libanks-Landell. And simple reason, Rochdale have conceded 7 goals this year, and 4 of those were when he weren't on the pitch. Absolute man-mountain of a defender, a leader, captain, defends his box well, organises those around him. Rochdale just always appeared to be a better football team, and he probably was a huge miss last year, which is part of the reason why Rochdale were so flimsy during the early part of the season. So yeah, they've conceded 3 goals with him on the pitch, and I think he's been an absolute man mountain for what is otherwise not an inexperienced side, but certainly a team that has a lot of guys that between maybe that 22 to 26 sort of bracket and are still sort of developing into that sort of maybe the age category you'd associate with leadership and all those sorts of qualities. So yeah, he was mine. Elsewhere in the division, I don't know. I think there's been a lot of good players. Probably not too many that have stood out to the same level. But I did want to shout out Josh Hamami, who, again, I mentioned him earlier, but he stepped in the centre half. He's scoring goals, playing off the front for Halifax. Been a big key reason as to why they're shooting towards where they are. So I suppose if we're going to give a shout out elsewhere, then let's throw Hamami in there.
I will have to just shout out one player finally, Luke, because given all that the Scunthorpe fans have had a go at me this year, I couldn't possibly not mention him. So I'm going to have to mention Ollie Ewing. I did mention him earlier, but every time I mention Scunthorpe, all the Scunthorpe fans are quick to mention about Ollie Ewing. Obviously, was at Buxton, I think, last year on loan, but has been terrific for them in midfield. And it has made a big difference. Him and Beeston have been a terrific partnership in there, and looks like a really good young player.
He was up there in like one of the players that I was picking. I know when I was speaking to a Scunthorpe fan when Halifax were playing him, he was saying watch Oliver Ewing because he's a talent that they've got there, in that midfield. And Beeston, someone who's going under the radar as well, I think, for Scunthorpe in this division. And even Rowley as well. I'd add to that. I don't actually think he played, did he, yesterday? I think he's been out injured, or might be suspended even. And, I think we already saw kind of potentially the loss of him. The player I'm actually going to go for, obviously, there's the obvious one. Regan Linney would be the one, I think, for me. But I feel like that'd be boring. So I'm actually going to go for Enrique Sousa over at Bournemouth, someone no one's mentioned yet on the wing. Not just the goals he's scoring, but also the assists that he's getting. He's been key to Bournemouth this season. And I'm actually remembering when he was at Grimsby, I used to always think, he's a frightening player that can turn defenders inside out. But the issue with him, whether that's, goals or even assists, his end product hasn't been there. Whereas this season, it's really come on, it feels, for him. I think he's already got 4 or 5 goals and then 6 or 7 assists as well. He's a frightening winger. And whenever I'm watching Bournemouth, he's always there alongside the attacking midfielder that you've mentioned as well. For me, Enrique Sousa is certainly a talent for me in this division, of course. He's been around a while, but I feel like, that missing piece to his game has really come on for me in the terms of getting the assists and even the goals that are needed. And I think there's a lot of size, Halifax, there's other players, individuals for me. But I would overall have to go for Linney. I just think he's the best individual. If there was one player I wanted to watch in this division, it would be him. And I'm dead certain if Carlisle United did not have Regan Linney, they would be nowhere near the playoffs at the moment, in my opinion. Anything else to add? Anyone?
No, I think we've covered most of the division, haven't we? If anyone wants to ask questions, they can get us hold of us on Twitter, and I'm sure we'll answer as many as we possibly can.
Well, lads, I really appreciate you coming on tonight, and of course discussing the National League with me. There aren't many people I could think better, to be honest, who I could get on. Of course, you're very, very both educated on the division overall. If you'd like to find Joe from Off the Line blog, of course, you are available on Twitter and appear on full time. And Ryan Deeney, of course, well known for being NL Musings. Of course, I believe you also work for Football Manager, don't you? For the National League too. If you'd like to find him, you can also, well, you can find him on Twitter, and of course he does that too. But lads, I really appreciate you joining me tonight. Please, everyone, remember to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time. Bye for now.